Hey sports fans, Coach Nick here, and welcome to B-Ball Breakdown on our nice new YouTube sets. With us today we have Brian and Andy Kamenetzky, longtime writers at LA Times and ESPN, and also of LandoLakers.com. Brian, Andy, thanks for coming on the show. Excuse me, let me make this right. Brian, Andy. Let's jump right into it, shall we? We were talking about Spurs and what they mean in the landscape of the NBA. So tell us, why do people always forget about them and not count them in when we're talking about title aspirations?
Well, it starts, I think, with that they're boring. I mean, and this is done intentionally. The Spurs have gone out of their way to avoid the sort of media attention that the Lakers draw to themselves, the Knicks draw to themselves, the Celtics draw, where it's this constant soap opera of controversy and player. Does Rondo get along with Doc? Does Dwight get along with D'Antoni and Kobe and all? They avoid all that. They have a star in Tim Duncan who sets the culture for the whole franchise, who doesn't want any of that stuff, who stays away from it.
The closest thing they've had to a tabloid fixture on that team has been Tony Parker, that period where he was married to Ava Longoria, and then they ended up getting divorced, and even then that didn't turn into a circus. But he's not the type of player that's necessarily a human highlight reel. You can't really think of anybody they've had in the Tim Duncan era, the last 15, 16 years, that plays above the rim. And those are the easy highlights. Those are the type of guys that end up on SportsCenter constantly. That's not the way the Spurs have played.
And I know I'm sure, Nick, you think they're fun to watch because they're just, the way they play and how they execute and all that stuff. But don't you think some of it's probably self-fulfilling at this point? Like we've heard for 10 years, 15 years, every time the Spurs are on TV, it's ratings death and all these other things that it becomes kind of self-fulfilling. You tell people they're boring long enough and people are going to decide that they're boring.
They're the equivalent of a movie with bad word of mouth. Before the movie even comes out, it's already been sunk because people are saying it's so bad.
Well, I think it's a testament to even a guy like Steven Jackson, who should be filling the tabloids up with all those things that he does and everyone else. But when he gets to the Spurs, it's a culture that they've established, I think.
Until this season.
Until this season,
right? But then what do? They just cut him. They just let him go. And it was interesting. I was at Staples Center when the Spurs were in town, very close to when they released Steven Jackson, and somebody asked Tim Duncan about that, and his response was, "Whatever Pop thinks is best for the team." Obviously, that's going to be what's best for the team.
By the way, are you going to give us the scoop here that I don't know about as far as why they ended up cutting him? Like, really why they ended up cutting him?
That I don't know.
From everything that I've read, it was Pop recognizing that Steven Jackson wasn't happy with his role. Some of the young wing players, Danny Green, Kawhi Leonard, they were taking a lot of his minutes. A guy like Corey Joseph has played very well, even though he's young, which would take away some of the ball handling role that Steven Jackson might have had. He wasn't happy about it, and they just decided we're going to part ways before this blows up into something bigger. But, their entire franchise has been you either buy in or you get out, and there is no exception.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think having a guy like Tim Duncan really helps you when you have that because he's such a solid, fundamental guy, which is exactly why it isn't so exciting in a way. But yeah, as a coach, when you watch him do a left foot pivot up and under off the glass, there isn't anything more exciting than that I could find, aside from the occasional alley-oop that you don't see that often. So there's no question, whenever you forget about the Spurs and write them off, boom, there they are back in the finals.
I think the Memphis series was a great example of that because the way that Memphis was playing in the playoffs and the way they got through the first round, you see that second round matchup against San Antonio. All right, Memphis is the hot team. They're playing great. They're so good defensively. Who's going to beat them? It's certainly not going to be the Spurs, except it is.
And you know what though?
It's so easy to look past San Antonio, not because they never lose, but just because they're never really the flavor of the month.
But you know what though? In fairness to the people like myself who actually thought that Memphis was going to advance and end up in the finals, they match up really well against San Antonio. When you talk about that front court, Marc Gasol and Zach Randolph is more talented and more potentially explosive on paper than Tim Duncan with Boris Diaw, Thiago Splitter. Those guys aren't scorers the way they are. You've got Mike Conley, Tony Allen, guys that you can put on Tony Parker or Manu Ginobili. So in fairness, it did look like a pretty good matchup, and the grindhouse is difficult to win on the road. The Spurs proved you can actually close out a series on the road there.
Well, make no mistake, this was the closest 4-0 sweep you're going to see. We had overtime. We had a very close game, another one. So they really played as close as they could, and Popovich said so. He said that this was not nearly what a sweep would normally look like. So there's no question the Grizzlies gave them all they could handle, but when it came down to execution and raw just being able to focus and play the right way, you know, the Spurs are so much light years ahead of where the Grizzlies need to be and ultimately might get to with a little bit more experience from this year's playoffs.
Yeah, and I think the overtime was at game 2 or game 3 where Duncan had, you know, all the points in the overtime. The way they were able to generate easy looks when they needed to, whether it was, you know, some of those great out of bounds calls where you get Manu popping up to the top of the key and then, you know, popping back down to the basket. All these easy shots that they get, and Memphis just can't do that. That's the big thing that's missing from the Grizzlies, you know, the ability to consistently space the floor. And then I'm sure a lot of people are saying, oh, they needed Rudy Gay for that series because they needed a wing scorer, except if they had Rudy Gay, they wouldn't have gotten that far.
They needed a wing scorer who wasn't Rudy Gay.
Right.
I mean, really, who they needed was Kawhi Leonard. You know, a good dynamic wing player who can space the floor, put him out in the corner, and you absolutely have to guard him, or, as we've seen series after series, he's going to knock down those shots. Even Danny Green, who I think isn't quite as dynamic as Leonard, they could have used a guy like him. It didn't necessarily have to be Rudy Gay.
They were basically down to Quincy Pondexter and Conley, and if those guys could hit enough shots, maybe they'd have a chance. If not, you know, they couldn't, because I mean, Zach Randolph against those interior defenders with San Antonio just didn't have much of a chance.
Well, I think what I tweeted this out earlier, and people responded was it said as much about the Spurs as it did about who the Grizzlies beat before that. That the Clippers and the OKC Thunder couldn't adjust to the Grizzlies and what they did as easily as the Spurs did. And I think that says a lot about it because in reality, all the Spurs did was they did a little double teaming down low and they just sat on the left hand of Zach Randolph. That's all they really had to do. And I believe that the other teams that they lost to them, like OKC and the Clippers, they had the ability to do that too, and they didn't. And I think that's the advantage that Pop brings.
You know, I was actually just talking with Meta World Peace for an interview that can be found at the Land of Lakers blog, and we ended up talking about the Spurs because, you know, they took out the Lakers in the first round. And Meta said that Popovich is the best coach I think he's ever seen in terms of finding out an opponent's weaknesses and capitalizing on them right away on the fly and making sure that all of his players know exactly what you're supposed to be doing. He said it's a rare ability that he has as a coach, and then especially when you've had some of the same players over and over and they really understand what he wants from you and they understand each other. But he's just great at identifying, you know, a disadvantage that an opponent has and just milking it for all it's worth.
And I think it gets to the system. It gets to that not just the system they play on the floor, but the system they have as an organization where they don't just take a guy and say, we need somebody who's a young athletic wing. They say we need a young athletic wing who can shoot from the corner because we need that, and, you know, can recover off a double team or something. They have very specific things that they're looking for with the guys that they go get, and they know why they're doing it. They know why Kawhi Leonard is a potential player that they would want to acquire, even at the price of George Hill, who was one of Greg Popovich's favorite players. He loved George Hill, but they knew what they needed and what he might be able to give them.
And then the culture
Right.
that they have is Kawhi Leonard comes in, they tell him, this is what you're going to do. If you don't like it, find another team to play for. They do that for everybody top to bottom.
And you know he's not going to complain because Kawhi Leonard hasn't spoken since he came into the league.
Right. Well, let's move from one proud organization to another, and that's the Boston Celtics. And let's talk about Paul Pierce and what his role is going to be going forward. I kind of argue that I don't think he's a starter anymore. I think he needs to find a team that's going to let him come off the bench and be like a microwave. What are you guys' thoughts?
I would let Paul Pierce start for my team. You just hope he's not. You don't want him to be your best player anymore. But he's still a very good player. You look at what he did, almost 19 points a game. I think he averaged about 7 rebounds, almost 5 assists. And when Rajon Rondo went down, he was really the only guy left on that team who could move the ball. You got to see a lot of his skill set and what he's able to do for a team. He just doesn't have that athleticism anymore to be able to get that shot off all the times against really good wing defenders. Yeah. But I would take him on my team.
Yeah, I think he's just not a guy that can carry the load anymore the way he used to. I mean, Paul Pierce used to be a guy that I think was pretty reliable in that you could count on him to get you through an entire series, maybe 2 series if he got really hot and he was able to physically carry that type of burden. And I think at his age, with the type of mileage that he has, he's just not capable of it anymore. But as your B guy, he'd still be fantastic. I mean, he still was really productive.
B and a half. I mean, if you could put him on a team where, you know, he's your Bosh, Your third best player? Oh my goodness, that's a great roster.
I mean, what I saw in the Knicks series was Iman Shumpert, a young upstart, getting in his face, taking him out like he couldn't even get by him. Now, the argument is without Rondo and other players, they could key on him and really make it difficult. And that certainly is a very legitimate point. But I got to say, I have this vision of him all of a sudden really being able to play for a good contending team, coming off the bench 25 minutes, scoring about 15 points, shooting 50%, very efficient, and really contributing that way and saving him another probably 2 or 3 years.
Well, I mean, I would imagine for Pierce, the most important thing he'd want at this stage of his career is just to be in a winning setting. I mean, he'd probably prefer it to be Boston because he's in that rare position of being the guy that stays with one organization as long as he has, and it's becoming more and more rare as time goes on in the NBA.
And he put his time in through the really bad Celtics teams. It's not like he was just, they were being great the whole time.
Right, but at the same time, though, you know that he, I would imagine, doesn't want to be around for another rebuild or to be there for the rebuild and not even be able to experience, the fruit of his labor. By the time they've rebuilt, he's going to be done. So if he's not going to be with the Celtics, I imagine he just wants to win.
Guys like him have to make a choice. Is it more important for me to finish my career in the same place or take a shot at another ring? And that might mean going from one team, being whether, let's say Boston buys him out and he's able to go wherever he wants, or they trade him and that team buys him out and he's able, is he going to go to one place? Is he going to play on 2 or 3 teams before he's done? It's not a great look. If you're Paul Pierce, if you're Kobe Bryant, if you're those guys, there is something to be said for not chasing after the ring, especially if you've already won, and he's had the chance to do that. I just think that for me, it's not so. The really interesting choice is what Boston does with him if he doesn't necessarily want to go. Like, do you just buy him out and say, sorry, man, the franchise is bigger than you? Well, culturally, I think it's tough.
Danny Ainge has already been on the record talking about the perils of keeping Larry Bird and McHale too long and not getting anything in return. So I think it's
But it's always easier to say that when you're not the one who had to pull the trigger on those deals. Mm-hmm. It's always easier to talk about what you would have done as GM if you didn't actually have to do it.
I mean, look, if you could get a lottery pick for Paul Pierce and you're the Celtics, that you probably do. You at some point, and time heals these things. We have a tendency, I think, to look at stuff now and be like, oh my God, it'd be the worst thing in the world. 5, 10 years from now, everybody kind of gets over it. He'd still be, a great Celtic. He'd still have his number retired and all of that. But at least, the thing that I worry about is if you're a free agent and you're looking at it and they say, wow, they just dumped Paul Pierce to save some money. It's one thing if you trade him, you get stuff back. They just dumped him to save money. If they do that to him, what are they going to do to me if I go over there?
In Boston, the Celtics have been an organization that at times have had difficulties recruiting free agents. It hasn't always been the most popular destination. So you have to think about that as well in terms of guys saying, if they're going to do Paul Pierce like that, I'm a sitting duck.
Well, let's move on to your bread and butter, the Lakers, and what you see shaping up in this very interesting offseason. What's going to happen with them?
Oh, well, let's see. My understanding is they do have some free agents. Devin Ebanks may not be back.
Goudlock,
you have to look at Andrew Goudlock.
Robert Sacre?
Yeah, no guarantee. I think Dwight Howard might be a free agent. I'd have to look that up. I remember seeing that on SportsCenter.
Can we get someone looking at that?
Yeah. Well, you've got until at least, I believe, July 8th or 15th or whatever it is to look that up because he's not going to make. Well, July 1st though.
The first day Dwight.
Right, July 8th, I believe, is officially when he can. It becomes pen to paper. Mm-hmm. We're not going to get a decision before back. So if you're dealing with dial-up right now, we can still look it up.
What Dwight does is obviously huge. The Lakers want him back, and if Dwight wants to come back, he'll be in LA. But the big question, I think, there are a couple. I think what happens if he goes, and I think for a lot of fans, there's a concern that it would be a total disaster. And I know, Andy, you don't necessarily think it would. The Lakers could bounce back from that if they play their cards right. It doesn't have to be a disaster if Dwight goes.
No, I don't think it is because one way or the other, they're going to have to rebuild, whether they're rebuilding around Dwight Howard or they're rebuilding with the decks completely cleared. Kobe Bryant off the books, Pau Gasol off the books, Metta World Peace, Steve Blake, basically Steve Nash and a bunch of cap space. It's not easy, and it may not happen as quickly as Laker fans want or the way the Lakers always talk about a team that wants to be in contention year in and year out. But it still gives them the opportunity to do it right. And they're still the Lakers. They're still Los Angeles. They're still a city that players will want to play, even if they're not the automatic given that they were with Dr. Jerry Buss and when they were just the cream of the crop in terms of destinations, they're still a team that I think is always going to be a player in the free agency mix, and they're going to actually have the cap space.
If nothing else, they could always pay people. And if Dwight goes, you can just take Pau and you should trade Pau Gasol for whatever young players you can get. Get some young players, get some draft picks, try to do it that way. Maybe you stretch out Steve Nash's contract, you use the stretch provision, you start to clear off as much as you can. If somebody will take anybody you have and give you anything of value that you might be able to use in a draft down the road, you can do it. It might make Kobe Bryant's potential last year a little awkward. Watch Kobe score 35 points coming back from an Achilles injury so the Lakers can be 14th in the conference. It's not a great look, but they would start that rebuild a year earlier. They only have one draft pick in the next first round pick in the next 3 drafts. Maybe you can pick up some more. Then you're surrounded. You look at the way teams get good. You need draft picks to do it. You can't just build through free agency.
Well, it's going to be really interesting to see because I think that Dwight Howard and Kobe Bryant's relationship is really the key here, whether or not Dwight wants to come back. I know there was reservations by Kobe originally when they played together on the USA team about not liking Dwight or not wanting him to come, his work ethic and those things. So after a year of what didn't seem to be very smooth sailings between them, I have to imagine that is going to be one of the biggest things he's going to have to decide about, whether he wants to continue playing with Kobe as a teammate.
Well, it's going to be one of the factors for sure, and I think a lot of this is thrown up in the air because you don't know with Kobe Bryant's Achilles injury and next year being potentially his last one, depending when he comes back, how healthy he's going to be, how effective he's going to be. Is he going to be satisfied with that being his last year? Because I firmly believed Kobe when he was talking about leaning towards retirement after the 2014 season. It's something I've actually thought for a while, even before he started talking about it publicly, because there's so many different parameters that a guy like Kobe wants to be playing. He's not a guy that's just going to play to be around the game. He wants to be the #1 option and the unquestioned leader of a team that's in contention, that is the Lakers. And it's difficult to make all of those factors keep lining up, particularly if a guy like Dwight Howard is in the mix and you want to be handing that torch off at some point, and you can't do that with Kobe. And I think Kobe's aware of that, but he also doesn't want to be seen as the guy hanging around too long to prevent that from happening.
I think he's made that abundantly clear. He will not play at any level that's lower than what we all perceive as Kobe Bryant.
Yeah.
More importantly, what he perceives.
I asked him one time, because he was talking about a couple years ago when Lamar Odom was made 6th man for that team. And in the beginning, Lamar was very reluctant about it, said that Phil Jackson must have fallen off his bed and bumped his head, thought it was such a silly idea. And
he lost his rabbit mind.
And Kobe was saying that he thought from Lamar's perspective it could be fun to play that type of role, come in, change the pace of a game, really be that kind of game changer. And I asked Kobe if he could ever picture himself way down the course of his career, maybe 36, 37 years old, taking on that kind of role. And he looked at me and said it was the stupidest question I'd ever asked him.
Which is not true.
No.
We've been doing this a long time. You've asked him many dumber questions.
I'm sure I asked him a dumber question that day.
Yeah, that wasn't even close.
But, Kobe is going to be Kobe for his career. And there's only so long you can keep doing that while still keeping the franchise healthy. But again, this Achilles injury adds a wrinkle that wasn't expected.
To your point about Dwight and whether or not you want to play with that, it's hard to talk about Kobe in a lot of these ways because Laker fans are very sensitive about it. And
you think?
A little bit. They are a little. One of the things I've learned, Laker fans can be a little sensitive.
I've always said that Laker fans see Kobe as this combination of half basketball god, half political prisoner.
Right. And so, I don't blame Kobe for all the things that Andy's talking about. Why would he want to play at less of a level than he's been? Why wouldn't he want to be the unquestioned leader of a team? Why would he do all those other things that would be compromises to the way he's played for almost 20 years in the NBA?
Oh, he's earned it.
Right, he's absolutely earned the right to do that. But if you're Dwight Howard, at some point, it's hard to play with Kobe because there are restrictions on you, not just in terms of how you get the ball, but also in terms of what you can say in the locker room, in terms of where the center of gravity of the team is going to be.
How you can grow in the locker room.
And all that kind of stuff. It's like, so if Kobe comes back next year, Dwight says, okay, I'll do that one, but what if he comes back for 2 years now? It's year 3 or year... It's one of the reasons that I wonder why, quite frankly, Dwight, if you just lined up basketball reasons, would come back here at all.
Well, if I had to guess, I would say he's leaning to not coming back. It looks like the Houston Rockets have a better structure of a team for him to go back to. So we shall see. It'll be very interesting. And I want to thank Brian and Andy for coming and joining us on this very illuminating discussion about all things NBA. And you tell us, where can we find you on Twitter?
At Cam Brothers.
Okay, so don't make it too difficult for them to find you guys.
You can find us both there at the same time.
Yeah. All right, terrific. So. Well, Andy and Brian, thanks for joining us. And don't forget, sports fans, at B-Ball Breakdown, we're not a channel, we're a conversation. You in? You guys in?
I was born in.
Absolutely. Inner than you can possibly be.
So in, we're almost out.